suppose I like working with leather because it is no two bits of leather will behave in the same way. So there's quite a challenge to the process of making. Well, I mean, maybe there isn't for everybody, but I certainly find it quite challenging in that you can kind of think, and often customers will come and say, they'll see a leather they like and they're like, right, I want a firm briefcase made of that leather, and you kind of think, that wouldn't do it, or to make it firm, by the time you made it firm it would weigh 6 kilos or something before you put anything in it. And so there's something about that. I like the idea of making things for functional purposes, rather than just an aesthetic. I like that kind of partnership where things have a kind of functional role, and traditionally leather products is all about function. Leather is still, it's not really rivaled by synthetic materials. And that, so yeah, I think that's why I stuck with leather. And you're always learning, I definitely don't feel like I'm a master. I don't think I've ever met a leather worker who would think that they were a master either. I think it's the nature of, there's always new things to learn. And I like the fact it's a really, we've been using leather for as long as there were people, it's always been something. It was something that was, in our history is understood that you eat animals because you need the protein of food, and also you need the resource of the skins and everything. Just kind of makes sense to me, really. So yeah, that's why I stuck with leather.
So what was the first thing you ever made with leather?
First thing, so when we had the kind of sheep hides, I was trying to make kind of like rugs or coverings and things in the house, none of which really worked. And then when we moved west, and so we were living on the farm, we were doing projects with kids at Fernhill Farm, and there's a leather wholesalers in Cheddar called A.W. Midgley, been around for ages, and they do kind of high-end car type leather or whatever, but they have a remnant bin, which is so you can buy certain bits of leather for £1, and I just happened to routinely drive past there, as I was kind of going back and forth to children's homes in Bristol and stuff, and so I would call in and pick up bits and then gradually start to learn more. And then I met a leather worker in Frome, he's been a leather worker his whole life. He went to Cordwainers, he did his apprenticeship in leatherwork and studied leatherwork, traditional hand skills leatherwork, and so I spent a bit of time with him, and we're still good friends now. I see him a lot, he pops in a lot, and so yeah, just gradually sort of learnt more skills, made more things. Then there was the Frome Independent Market, so I was making things for myself and home, so suddenly I got some kind of scraps of belt leather from A.W. Midgley, so I started making belts, and there was various things that suddenly people ask you to do certain things. It just gradually evolves, and then I started making things and I was thinking, well, I've got 2 belts, I don't need 3, and so I would gradually collect stuff, and I started doing the Frome Independent on the hill, as the suitcase seller, which is a brilliant thing because it's cheap. It's £15 to have a pitch, and it's what you can fit in a suitcase. So you don't have to have a shop's worth of stock. You can have you've used remnants to make a few extra bits, and you can have a go at selling. And then there was various people who were interested. And lots of people couldn't believe I'd made it, so people would stop and say, well, let me look at your hands, I don't believe you made it. And I kind of, because they expect them to be kind of calloused and gnarly, and they are pretty calloused, to be fair. I have got pretty tough fingers, but yeah. And so yeah, then it just kind of grew. But so we bought 2 acres on the edge of an industrial estate, where they used to take trains from London and tube trains and blow them up at a metal recycling plant. So it wasn't like the good life. It was kind of, that was the dream, but it wasn't quite like that, but we had this land anyway, and so we grew our own food, and then we would rear farmers' orphan lambs and kind of calves that had needed extra care, things like that, because we couldn't do kind of big scale farming. It was only really tiny because we only had a few acres. But so then when we took the animals to slaughter, when it came time for that, I didn't want to waste anything, so I brought everything home. So yeah, I brought all of their hides and their feet and all sorts. Because makes you think about not wasting things really when you see the effort that goes into rearing an animal, and also they give their life for you to eat them. You use the rest of it as well. It's kind of crazy not to, and it changes the way you think about things.
It does.
That's a good thing.
So how did you go from bringing the leather home to tanning it?
Well, not very successfully. So I had a bash, but there's a lot of scrubbing the fat off. So when you get the hides, they're all kind of wet and jellyish, and then you have to scrape off all the fat, which is really, really hard work. And then you cure them in a kind of salt solution, and then gradually stretch them and do various things to them. But it's grueling, and it's horrible, and it's a real art. So, like with anything, as soon as you explore how things are done traditionally in kind of traditional methods, you realise that everything's an art form, isn't it? In terms of, and so tanning is. So all the leather I use, every tannery does something differently. So most of the leather I have is vegetable tan leather, which is only makes up for 15% of leather globally. I think it's tends to be chromium tanned because it's much quicker. But much more toxic.
Chromium's not very nice, is it?
No, it's not great. And, it's like we all know, there's a cost to cheap things somewhere down the line, and it's exactly the same with leather. So lots of chromium tanned leather is produced in the developing world. And in which case then the disposal of the chromium will not be regulated in the way it would be in Europe. So there's all sorts of things that, along the chain. That's why I think leather's had a bad press in some ways, and the textile industry has, and rightly so. Because lots of things have not been as they should be, but there are still tanneries, small tanneries all around the world doing things traditionally with a low impact or as low impact on the natural world as possible. There is always some kind of impact. But so this is vegetable tanned, and this is vegetable tanned here in the UK, which is relatively unusual. We don't have a huge amount of tanning, but
How difficult is it to know your supply chain?
Really difficult with leather, actually. In terms of it's not difficult to trace leather back to a tannery, and there's reputable tanneries and not so reputable, or chromium tanned or vegetable tanned or whatever. Not that you get perfectly reputable chromium tanned leather. There is that is tricky when you talk about sustainability. It's if vegetable tanned leather is okay and chromium tanned is just not. Whereas actually vegetable tanned that's produced in the developing world compared to chromium tanned in in Europe, actually probably it would be difficult to judge which was having more negative an impact, probably. Florence, which is the big kind of area in Italy of producing vegetable tanned leather traditionally, there's a consortium of vegetable tanners which is like a sign of quality and sustainability. So there's various things like that, which means you can know what you're getting and know that it's kind of being responsibly produced. But tracing the hides back to the farms, so where an animal has actually been farmed, is almost impossible. So this is, and the interesting thing about this is, so we know that this is vegetable tanned locally, so we know that there's not been loads of travel miles, because there's an awful lot of cattle that are raised in America or wherever that are then tanned in Italy or Spain, that's then transported to leather wholesalers in the UK. So there's a lot of miles to it, and also there's no sense of knowing about the animal welfare or the land management, because everything comes back to land management really. So Jen and Andy in Fernhill Farm, where this leather's from, are one of the first registered regenerative farmers. It's kind of, so that's what they've always done. It's always been about not growing quick growing grasses, but having kind of mixed, diverse herbs and grasses growing and long-term grazing, that you don't overgraze and stop rotation, and that's what they've always done. But now there's kind of growing evidence and a growing interest in really understanding the impact of that. So we know that this has come down the road from a regenerative farm where the cattle are outside all the time, they're never kept indoors. It's a small herd that, so it's kind of...
Is its quality different? Do you notice a difference in it, having knowing it's...
This was one of the first... Well, this was the first that they had done, but this is kind of the end of a side. So there was two sides, and just to have it tanned, the cost was £600. And that was part of a collection of farms, and I think there was, there must have been like 100 hides, because you have to do things in such a big scale, which for most small scale farmers, they don't have 100 beef cattle hides to tan at the same time.
Yeah.
So you have to do things as part of a collective, and that's where sort of the carbon impact becomes bigger, because there's loads of sending things all over the place. So, so I think one thing that's interesting is because it's had a wild life, these cattle, there's loads of kind of scarring that's evidenced on the hide, which I think is nice. It's kind of, leather should look like leather. It doesn't need to look like it wasn't an animal, in my opinion. And so, and this actually polishes up nicely, and the colour comes out, so it kind of needs a finish on it, just kind of wax finish. So you're keeping it all natural. But and then it comes up really nicely. So we've made some journals and things like that from this, and purse. We're going to make about. We're going to make it to fit these buckles, because these buckles are cast in brass from the UK foundry. So of which there aren't very many, but lots of things are imported. So these are cast in solid brass and then given a kind of nickel plate. That's what we're going to use. So we want to cut the strap to fit this centre bar. These are called centre bar buckles. So it's a 38mm strap, which is kind of 1.5 inch, which is pretty standard. So I'm going to go actually just under, and we're going to cut one and see. So we'll just tighten it up, and then, so with this tool I've cut a straight edge in here already, hopefully. I'm just checking that it is actually straight. And then you're keeping the edge of the leather against this wooden flat handle. So it only kind of works with firm leathers. You can't cut kind of soft squidgy leathers in this way, and you just pull it down, and we should end up with a really nice consistent strap. Which instantly, actually, I think I've done a bit wide, like remembering there's a bit of a kind of give on this buckle. So, in theory, we've got a really nice consistent strap, and you can just kind of check it by kind of lining it up and making sure it's the same all the way down. We're going to choose whatever end we want to be the kind of tongue end, because that will be more on display than the buckle end. So I like this because we've got that kind of natural, and this has got kind of what they call a pull-up, so it lightens when you put it under pressure. Just gives it a bit of character, really. And we're going to, it's always worth checking the back of leather as well to make sure. So I think we're going to put the end in here. Marking the end, I always give it a slightly longer tongue than the template allows for. I also choose to do 7 holes on mine. Traditionally I think it's 5, but my weight fluctuates, and I don't mind a bit more wiggle room. So we've got that there, and then I'm going to measure. So with belts, they're not actually your kind of the same as your waist measurement, which is confusing. So if you're a 32-inch trouser, then you'd want it to measure to kind of 36 inches till from where the kind of buckle attaches here. So if I go to the middle hole there, and I'm going to go to 36, because 32 is a fairly good size, I think. In fact, I might even go to 37. So I'm just going to mark in here where that's where our prong's going to sit. So we cut that out after, and this is where our screws are going to go in. And usually you always mark on the top of leather, whereas fabric. Next thing to do before we kind of bash these holes out is we're going to thin down this back part, because if you were to have a belt that's folded over like that, you've got a lot of bulk at the buckle end. So we're going to take just a bit of leather out where that folds over. So let's just see. Okay, we're getting there. Yeah, it's going to sit nicer. Do it. So it's not an expensive tool at all, but actually gives you a really nice, clean hole for the tongue of the buckle. These are different sizes, so this is 4 because I'm thinking about the sizes of the screws which are going to hold it together. We're going to be using belt screws because I quite like the look, so I'm just going to hammer out those holes that we marked at the beginning. Almost impossible to see the holes. It's funny because on a really clean leather you really would do kind of tiny marks and it's so obvious. It's different looks. In terms of shape we've got different options, but I think I'm actually going to do it quite square because I quite like that. So, come out there. This end will go right here. And with this I'm just lining it up against the lines on the board to keep things as square as possible. So, and then I'm going to shape these. You've got these kind of standard belt punches where you would just cut around into the end, but I'm liking doing quite square ends, but just if you end up with really square they'll end up dogged and kind of catching, so it's just taking off, just rounding them off ever so slightly. So this corner tool is so sharp you don't even have to hammer it, you can just cut it round. Just takes off any hard edges. Same the other end. Yeah, nice. So that's going to be our basic design. But at the moment we've got again sharp sides, so we're going to bevel all of the edges, and that's actually that's looking quite good. Just want to say we've gone a bit thinner on that side than this side, so I'll take that off by hand. But before we do that, we will bevel. The underside always, when you're beveling leather, always comes off a little bit kind of grainy, but this will just give us our nice round, slightly rounded, not sharp kind of feel. I fold over. And I'm going to take off the top side, which will come off a bit more cleanly. As the top side of the leather is always kind of a tighter finish. Marked at the beginning. Needle go. And then we've got our holes. Badger head brass die that was made by a lovely guy in Wales, who, this is all he does, is make stamps for leatherwork. And it's very true that not all stamps are created equally. So this has got a nice, well, you'll see it gives a really nice indentation, but doesn't cut the leather. It's all about kind of just putting it under pressure. And then I'll just give it a minute to kind of settle. And that was it. We should have a beautiful badger head. Colours of this one. So we're just going to wet it and then start the process of tightening the fibres. You kind of need wetness and friction is the gist to start the process. This is just kind of a wooden tool for burnishing, so this is what will apply your friction. So with the water we're just starting to tighten up these fibres. They say you know when something is kind of becoming burnished because it will start making a kind of clicking noise. We probably need to get a bit more wax on there first, but you can actually hear it's already starting to go, and it feels so much smoother. This is just a liquid wax, but it does give a nice, helps it along its way for a nice glossy waterproof finish, but all natural. Nearly all fashion belts that you would buy, or would be, the edges would be finished in an acrylic coating, which when you're using such a nice natural material. And then when we do the next burnish of this, we're going to use like a heavyweight denim and kind of pull it through rather than using the wood. So you're just kind of pulling it through, quite like I'm gripping it quite tight. And then you keep on turning it around and doing it different ways. Sometimes you can just feel a slightly lifted bit on the edge, which is why it's worth always finishing it. This is just a kind of natural leather feed, but we'll clean off any of the burnishing agent that we've got where we don't want it. It'll darken when it first goes on, but it lightens as it soaks in. You could just use beeswax with this, but I just quite, of all the feeds, I just quite like this one. So I'm just working loads of the feed into where it's, because that's on the bend, that's where it's going to be put under the most pressure. So I figure making sure it's full of nice natural oils to keep it supple is a good bet. Up into there. And then I'm just going to skive this down. And this is the bit you want to be nice and flat. For the underneath. Flat but not so flat, it will break. So, yeah. This is just a smaller punch because I don't want to take out a very big hole, I just want it to be and then I'm just kind of like holding it over because it does actually take a while for the leather to you know, get used to being bent in that way. I don't want to spring back. And again, these belt screws came from the foundry, so we know that they've been produced responsibly, and they're solid brass underneath again, like the buckle. And this is the one that's normally slightly more awkward to put in because we're just working it over the stay. There we go. With a bit of luck, we've got a lovely vegetable tanned leather belt. Which, yeah, so we've got through the leather stay, so it's got kind of the more traditional belt look, and then we'll go through the metal stay as well for your smarter look. There you go.